always knew that I had a lot of coming from the social psychology realm. I just understood a lot about social identities and group dynamics, as well as the multicultural tenets of psychology that I felt could really be useful in STEM spaces among professors who really want to become more aware of what they can do, how they can intervene, and how they can intentionally design the curriculum, as well as group-related projects to center the ideas of equity and inclusion. And so in my position, I do think about both racial, gendered, ability status, levels of inclusion as well, but something about the racial inclusion just really kind of sticks with me because of my research around coping with race-related stressors, and from and actually kind of shifting to how do we not put the onus on the individual to shift and navigate how they manage their identities in this space, but put it onto the systems and put it onto the people who are responsible for creating these spaces. And so I'm like, yeah, no more talking directly to us. If I do go into that lane, which is what my website is about, which is beneaththefacade.org, it's more so coming from the lens is how do we recognize what a microaggression is, and how do we intentionally not internalize these pieces, as well as really just centering a level of like liberation. That's why I don't really feel like I'm fighting for racial equity. I no longer want to fight anything. I think it's the fight is on someone else now to do, and maybe for them it might feel like a fight because they're not used to it. But in my space, I'm like, no, I'm just going to be in the flow and center my own humanity, center the humanity of others, and do my best to be, authentic and do what resonates with my spirit and my soul. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'll jump in after Dr. Womack. It's so wonderful to hear from everyone. And I don't want to cut in line, Dr. Randolph, but I feel like a lot of what you just said is really relevant to why I'm doing what I'm doing now. So as a person of color, obviously a Black woman who grew up in a low-income environment and was the first to college and first generation, all of those things, navigating my my pursuit of higher education and all through my academic career has always been a challenge, because I'm carving that path for myself and folks behind me. And it wasn't until my grad experience at the University of Southern California where I really started to understand that a lot of the challenges wasn't really about me and about my so-called deficits and a lack of kind of understanding the system, but the system itself. And at that moment, as a graduate student, really struggling at the time with continuing forward in the career path that I thought was where my interests were, I found myself pulled towards the need for creating community and spaces where people like me could thrive and have safer space. And Dr. Randolph will talk a little bit more about those things in a bit. But that's what I'm doing now. I feel like most of my work is really centered on structural change. Dr. Foster and I will talk more about that in a little bit too, but really to change the system and to get people to understand that institutional and systemic racism are the root of the problem, a lot of what we see in academia and higher education. So training the next generation to be able to get to where they want while dismantling white supremacy culture in this work is a lot of my focus to date. So I'm excited to be here and to learn from others on the panel and to talk more about what that looks like.
That was awesome. I'm going to go last. I'm going to try my best not to echo everything that all of these great individuals have already said before me. I think for me, I kind of have been in this space for a long time. Grew up in Atlanta, right downtown. Grandmama was an activist. She even shared her story on one of our blogs about how she was locked up as a kid in one of the MLK protests, and, you know, just being in that space. And it's just so interesting now being an adult and traveling all over. Oregon was like state number 4 for me, like Georgia, Alabama, Texas, then Oregon. It wasn't until here recently that I realized how blessed I was to be in this space with a grandmother that was so connected to all of the great civil rights activists. We have so many pictures of John Lewis in our house. It didn't even dawn on me how much of an icon he was, because you just get so used to just seeing certain folks, you know, my grandmother, and she's like, Mom, you know, you see your mom talk to these people all the time. So you just really don't grasp the heaviness and, you know, and really understand like the company that you're around. And so I was just really blessed and fortunate to be able to watch and absorb all of those great things from all of those people and just blend it into a lot of the things that I'm doing. And then also, like, you know, Letisha, Dr. Wyatt was saying, being a first gen student like myself, growing up in certain neighborhoods, you just don't have any opportunities. Like nobody was coming into my schools asking anything, let alone providing an opportunity to get involved and get engaged. It just did not happen. And so that's one of the reasons why I kind of got into the space, because I saw how hard it was for me to, first of all, be in there, sustain myself in that space without a lot of support, and then trying to carve a way in my own place. It's really hard to do that in academia. And so that's why I got into the Youth Engagement Science program. I really wanted to get back in the community there, or even going out the country and all over Africa, making sure that those folks over there have the support that they need as well. And then, you know, now doing community engagement work in Minnesota, which is the birthplace of this last movement that everybody has, that has sparked a lot of these conversations, bring a lot of stuff to the forefront. So I'm just very blessed and fortunate to be the link now between Portland and the community folks in Minneapolis and both universities at OHSU and in Minnesota. So yes.
Great. That was all awesome information to hear from you guys, and to hear more about your stories and backgrounds and where you're coming from in this, I'm not going to say fight anymore, this movement for racial equity. And so I think maybe it might, you know, some of these questions are more formed around your organizations and challenges and rewarding aspects that you felt during that. But I think something that we might want to start off with is some of these later questions, which, after being involved in academia and moving towards racial equity and making changes in your institutions, maybe if we can talk about some of the specific initiatives that can be implemented at the academic level that are effective actually in not only increasing racial equity, but retaining racial equity in these STEM fields. I know, coming from a female perspective, a lot of it is we have gotten young women involved in science, but then they don't get retained in science. They fall off at some point. So I think that's probably a similar cause or a similar issue when it comes to racial equity work. So if whoever wants to jump on board and start talking about that, I think that might be a good way to move that conversation.
I want to think a little bit more about what my response will be, but I also want to invite us to even thinking about this through like a highly intersectional lens. So when we speak about women, you have women of color as well. And so and when we think about racial equity, that's also gendered too. So I'm going to still think a little bit more about what my response will be, but I just wanted to bring in that idea.
So I think part of it is, and I get this question asked. I'm asked this question pretty frequently, and I feel like my answer is typically the same each time, and probably hasn't changed, maybe even for years. And that is, I think that my real answer is that I think that folks need to understand how systemic oppression works and understand what the drivers are. And I just don't know. And you can put Black folks, you can put women, you can put whatever you want in the center of what the systemic oppression is. but it all manifests sort of using the same type of mechanisms. There's a same underlying issue underneath all of it. It's patriarchal systems, it's white supremacy, it's colonialism, it's these drivers, these vehicles that have created systemic oppression in every space that we're in. And I think that when you understand sort of how those manifest, and there are four main sort of categories of how all of this works. And I kind of say this, if anyone's ever heard me speak before, then you've heard me say it before, but basically there are four main ways that this happens. We internalize it. There are the internal ways that we sort of think about systemic, or that we house our, let me start again. So there are the internal ways that systemic oppression is sort of manifest within us. That's through our values, our thoughts, our behaviors, the way that we understand the world. We use this understanding in our interactions with other people. So that's the second driver. We have internal, we have interpersonal. And that's sort of what we're familiar with. We're familiar with the way that, let's take systemic racism, how that we're familiar with some of the thoughts that are racist thoughts and some of the racist actions that folks can have between each other. And we talk about education being a really important part of that. And I agree that it is. That's part of what my job is. But the other part that I feel like we don't talk about as much is looking at the policies, procedures, and history that have, even we can even say just within our own organizations that have roots in racism and white supremacy. And I think that the best thing organizations can do is sort of look at this holistic, like look at how these four vehicles show up for every car that you're driving, essentially. How does misogyny show up in the way that our internal thoughts, the way that we interact with each other, and what policies and procedures do we have in place to be able to uphold that? The same thing is with systemic racism, the same thing is with all of these. I think that what we have to do is start taking a really serious multimodal approach at how we address this. And then when we find it, we have to be okay with letting it go. That's the other part. We have to be okay with, if we're really trying to be anti-racist institutions or fill in the blank institution, we have to be willing to let the problems go, let the people go, change our values, align ourselves with what we say we care about. And if other folks aren't rocking with it, then that's fine. They can go and be okay with that commitment. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, with the question being kind of like what could be some initiatives within academia that could promote or increase racial equity in STEM fields. Some things I'm thinking about are just the idea of really outlining and demonstrating and writing, what is your commitment? What is your commitment to racial equity in your professional space, and as well as on outside of the university? Like, how are you showing that you value the humanity in everyone you encounter, as well as not doing this from a colorblind angle, but seeing like, how are you treating those who do not look like you, both in your institution and outside of your institution? I think creating opportunities for other people to be, I don't know if it's a level of accountability, but I think actually asking your peers and those who are in your community to describe how they demonstrate this commitment. And for some, it could be like, wait a minute, I don't. It's like, okay, good. This is a good starting place. So where do we go from here? I also think about the idea of making sure that we aren't marginalizing the concept of racial equity, meaning how are we integrating this into everything that we do? It gets real ironic, like when you have an initiative and then it's like, oh yeah, well, let's bring in somebody to talk about race. And it's like, wait a minute, race is involved in everything that we do. So in that way, you're actually kind of like marginalizing the concept, even in the creation, because it wasn't you didn't center it in the creation of whatever you were doing. It was like the add-on. It's like we're going to throw this article in at the very end of the semester. right? Let's talk. So I think about the positioning of when you decide to have these conversations is a way to ensure that a way to increase a level of racial equity, as well as really thinking about like what are the recruitment efforts, where are you targeting people, what are your outreach what is your outreach programming looking like, as well as once thinking about how can we possibly blind the review process, various review processes, all review processes. As well as thinking about, okay, well, once people are inside or it's like, what then? What are the retention efforts? Are you creating, are you supportive of affinity groups or racial-based affinity groups? Are there some levels of, I don't think just the idea of like mentoring, because sometimes like if it's like, oh, well, mentoring is the answer, but I agree, but then also mentoring kind of suggests that one person is high and the other person is low, and the person that's low needs to get to where the person high is, and that could be a little questionable too. So it's like, what are ways that we can do this in a way where we're not kind of like infantilizing the person who we're bringing in? It's like, oh, let me show you how it's done. Could we expand this idea and possibly make it a space for co-creation? So I think that those are just like a few things that we can do to center racial equity in our work, particularly in STEM fields.
All of those comments are just like, I love to hear it, because we're all on the same page. And one of the things that has been really great for us at OHSU is the Alliance for Visible Diversity in Science. I want to just kind of shout out AVDS as a advocacy group that has really functioned at a high level. I mean, it's a group of volunteers, primarily students, and that started in 2016. And I would say on campus has become a major resource for leadership, and has been recognized as a place to learn more about the problem, and learn more about ways to solve the problems that exist in our space with regards to racial. Zenodo community. If you're unfamiliar with Zenodo, it's a online, free, open repository. Maybe we can find the link and put it in the chat. But much of what the group has done, they've published on Zenodo. And some of those documents are, multi-page documents on recommendations that the university can make, ways of restructuring how we work towards racial equity and dismantling white supremacy in the institution. And one of the things that comes up a couple of things that comes up for us all the time when we're talking about initiatives, one, we need to center Black voices and center BIPOC experiences. And just like Dr. Womack said, like, let's not create these false power dynamics and differentials. This is something that AVDS has also thought a lot about. Early on, it was kind of structured with a president and all of these other things that fall underneath it. And that sort of hierarchical structure just recapitulates a lot of these white supremacist cultures and stuff, right? So pretty quickly, this was Dr. Foster's recommendation, is that we restructure how the group interacts with each other to eliminate those, some of those things that we are trying not to perpetuate. And what we have found is that by giving everybody a voice and centering people who are most at the margins, you can improve things for all of the people in between, right? So listen to the people who are most affected, who are in your spaces. I think that's the one thing that comes up for the group all the time. We get asked, what can we do as an institution? What can we do to improve things, make things better? And there's so much that's already available and that's already been communicated. Act on that. Act on any of that. Listen to the people who are telling you what they need. One of the biggest things that we've also found is that retention is our biggest challenge. I think universities think a lot about recruitment. You know, we need to increase the numbers. It's a chicken and egg kind of scenario, right? Maybe if we had higher numbers of people, then the environments would be better. But we argue that if we can improve the environment first, then it's more of a snowball effect. So let's work and focus on retention. If the people who are most marginalized feel included in their environment and feel like people are listening to them and supporting them as they should be, then that is going to spread, and very quickly. Bad news travels fast, obviously. So we really talk and think a lot about retention. All of our initiatives, we focus on what can we do to improve the culture, improve the environment, to retain and support the people who are here, who are usually expressing their needs. Yeah, so those are kind of the things that AVDS thinks a lot about. Hopefully we'll have time to talk a little bit more about the proposal that came out of the group about how to restructure this kind of work, generally speaking. But the initiatives, I think, need to be centered on the people who are most affected and focused on retention, typically.
I definitely agree and echo with everything that has been said before me. I was actually doing a training for a company that I'd rather not say the name, but I was just starting off like really simple. Like, let's look at your policies, your bylaws, all of those things that you have, and just look at historical ways that you are not aligning with being diverse and inclusive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then from there, when we talk about changing all of those policies and all of those, like, you know, constitutional bylaws type of things, when people get together, can you just tell me what you want, like what the culture will be like once everybody comes along? Because I think the culture is one thing that people are missing. They're like so frantic about action plan, action plan, action plan. We're going to change this, we're going to change that. But really, did it change the culture? Did it change the environment within your company? Because if it does not, then you're just going to keep spinning your wheels, because people are going to come and they're going to be like, this is not for me. And then they're going to leave just like that. And it's going to be nothing that you can do, because like nobody wants to be in that environment willingly, right? They're going to find a safer space. That's how I actually ended up coining the name for this company that we have, this mental health company. And then just like if you know, like I'm selling this company, once you get to the point where you can ask yourself the hard question, like once everybody gets together, like what is the culture that you want to have in your space? And then be forward thinking, think about the next question, like the next thing that you want to move to. Because I think so often people get stuck on one thing and it's just like the spinning wheel. And then 6 years later, you're like, wow, we're still on question 1. Okay, now let's sit down. Let's did you do all of those things that you say you're going to do? If not, let's fix it and let's just move on. Because so many people in this space get so tired of saying the same things like over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then we get creative and like, let me just rephrase my answer just a little bit to make it sound new so that I can get a different response or some type of movement forward. And then also, like, what are the people in the space that you want to have to be the voice, right? And it's so important. Like, okay, you're talking about these new questions. Why can't you center those people, like everybody was saying in the very beginning, so that you can create an accountability plan? And then it's bi-directional, right? So we went in this direction, and then you can always go backwards. Like, okay, I have this accountability plan. I said I was going to move forward with this question. Did I do that? And then I want to make sure that all of these dots go back to the culture that I wanted to have, so that we can go back and then look at the policies. It's not a one-way thing. It's very bi-directional. I just want to express that, because I think so much in this space we get so caught up in just this one way. No, you have to go forwards and you have to go backwards to make sure that everything that you just did to get to the end is actually doing what you want. And you have to go back and be able to explore those. And if not, great, you're back at square one, change the policies and make sure that it fits those things. And so, so I just wanted to point that out. And then with one of the other programs that I think does a really great job of this is the Meyerhoff Program. They are exceptional at creating this environment, this culture where all of the students actually support one another. The staff supports the students. It's really great. And they crank out some of the best STEM scientists you can ever dream of, surgeon generals, leaders of the COVID vaccine, like the list goes on and on and on. And we're actually trying to get the Meyerhoff Program at the University of Minnesota. We just submitted a $20 million grant because we just believe in that program so much. And then also creating, once you have the safe space, because I think also people are so quick to create initiatives and they don't think about the space and the culture in which they're bringing these students and these fellows or these, workers or anybody in, and it just causes more harm. And they're like, yeah, you got this initiative, but what good is it doing when you're damaging everyone in that space? So I just tell people all the time, please make sure that you do what is necessary to get upper leadership, mentors, everybody on the same page, because all of the effort will literally be for naught. And then nobody would want to come to your program. And then also kind of think backwards a little bit. And so for us, with the Meyerhoff program, we're very intentional about the pathways into that program, because we really want to make sure that we're getting the youth involved and making sure that they have a strong basis so that they can get into a lot of these proven programs that's been around, like Meyerhoff 30 plus years, that's is proven to have a great track record at developing and producing young BIPOC folks in STEM.
I just want to emphasize something that everybody said so far, or that everyone said so far, but I just think it's worth repeating. This idea of recruiting people into unsafe environments. I mean, I think that we have this idea, like everyone said, that when you bring people in, you kind of change the environment, not realizing how resistant the environment is to change. And at AVDS, at OHSU, we always had people telling us that the thing that we needed to focus on is more recruitment, more recruitment, more recruitment. And what we feel is that recruiting more people into unsafe environments is unethical. And we want people to almost have, and that's not to say that recruiting people is not something that should be part of your plan, but if your plan doesn't heavily invest in cleaning house so that it's a safer environment in the first place before recruiting, or at least while you're recruiting, then it's not an equitable plan. I think that maybe from back when in the 90s, when we're talking about affirmative action, I think that may have set the standard that to be able to have diverse environments, that's just, we need to have a certain number of people and then we did it. But we have to move away from this idea because it's antiquated and it's also wrong. And so in our own spaces, I imagine I don't have to really know where anyone on the call works, or is, where anyone on the call works, to say that I bet most people have measured racial, like, if they're hitting the mark based on how many people they have in the room. And I wanted to emphasize that point to say that now everyone on the call knows that that's an inequitable and harmful strategy, because we have to, it's like, because this is Women in Science, it's like putting a woman in a space with all men who have like really toxic masculinity behaviors and thoughts and ideas. That means the policies are probably all very steeped in patriarchy and misogyny, and that's not going to be a place where you thrive. So it's the same situation, to stop thinking about numbers and really thinking about the environment, and for everyone on the call to be able to advocate that in their own space.
I love that so much. I just wanted to say yes.
I think, Anita, you touched on it briefly. There's a question in the chat that indicates, is there any example of an academic or other environment that has been successful at removing the hierarchy? And if so, what does that look like? And I don't know if the Meyerhoff program is a really good example of that, or you can think of another example, or maybe give a little insight as to what the Meyerhoff program does that makes it so successful.
Yeah, so the Meyerhoff program started about 30 something years ago, and they kind of create this family structure for all of their students that comes in, and they focus on 13 different things to make a person successful in STEM. So it's just not 1, 2, 5, and they pour a lot of money in it. And to make sure that those students have support. I was just talking to University of Maryland, Baltimore County is where it originated from. And I was kind of blown away when they spend at least $1.5 million on staff per year to make sure that those students are successful, right? That's number one. And then number two, they understand that there's also financial hardships with a lot of these students in these populations, and they put their money where their mouth is, and they said, we're going to do at least $6 million a year in scholarship funding. And so a lot of the things that I love is that even in the recruitment of these students, they are so intentional. They do not separate the students from the family. They pay for the students and the family to come to all of their recruitment events. So I think that that's number one. Once those students get an admissions to the Meyerhoff, they do a summer program, right? And so right before school even starts, they come on campus, they get this major orientation, they get hooked up with the older students, and then they do all of these assessments tests, and they figure out where those students are going to need help from. And then right off the bat, they start tutoring before they even do their first day as an undergraduate freshman. You know, that support system is already there. Their academic counseling goes to the Meyerhoff program, right? Because a lot of times, a lot of the academic advisors, especially with folks who don't look like you, it's rough. You know, I went to a real big school that was predominantly white, and it was a miracle if I could even get my advisor to even acknowledge my presence for more than 5 minutes a semester. Could not care less, did not care if what they were advising was correct or not. And so Meyerhoff said, nope, we're going to do that. So they do all of their academic advising in-house. And then also their career coaching is also in-house as well with their staff, which I think is very important, because you have no idea how many times in the South somebody has told me to stay sweet, which is in the South. When a man tells you that, is that you hold your head down as a Black woman, and you are to be seen and not heard. And you need to stay sweet and say yes, sir, and no, sir, and go have a seat and do what I say do. And several times with career counseling, they actually told me to be a nurse, like work in a nursing home as a caretaker, because I just love people so much, and I just love family members and all of that type of stuff. And so to mitigate a lot of the microaggressions and expectations that other folks have upon us, because I have been told so many times that I did not belong in this space, Meyerhoff just completely cuts that out. Even your career counseling goes through them. And then they have family nights where you're not allowed to talk about school. You're only allowed to talk about personal things and personal problems and things like that, and get support from your peers and other people. And they also have our program, we wrote in mental health services through Safer Space. A lot of times students don't feel comfortable doing any type of counseling or therapy on their campus. I can give a million reasons why. And so we even wrote in there that Safer Space will do all no-cost mental health services through culturally vetted providers. And so Meyerhoff just has this system where they have thought about every angle where a student will need support and help outside of academia, outside of finances. It's like a holistic approach. And so I really think that program is really amazing. And, I'm a big advocate for it.
Yeah. I wanted to add too, the Meyerhoff program is great. And I wanted to also lift up historically Black colleges. Historically Black colleges and universities have been doing this for the past 100 or plus years. So this is not a new concept, the idea of having a Black student, also including Hispanic serving institutions, right? Native American serving or folk-centered institutions. None of this is new. The predominantly white schools maybe just realize, wait a minute, we should probably actually nurture and care for and not center elitism with our students, with 18-year-olds, with people who are still trying to figure out life, right? And so I just wanted to say we have a lot of models in the United States, but it's about the humility of some certain institutions to have a level of self-awareness to say we're getting this wrong, and we've been excusing ourselves for getting this wrong for a really, really long time. And also shout out to Howard. I'm in there.
That is wonderful. Thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Womack, because yes, there are plenty of great examples if we look to HBCUs and other minority serving institutions. I think, that level of self-awareness in predominantly white institutions is where maybe many of them are grappling with right now, is just like trying to figure out where their gaps are. A concern that I have, and I mean, this was one of the predetermined questions that maybe I'll just open up. One of my concerns is the ability for predominantly white institutions to actually be able to move away from white privilege and white dominance. And I think when we're talking about centering the voices of people who are most marginalized in these spaces and providing solutions for supporting them appropriately, that means some of the leadership that's, predominantly white, they're going to have to give up some of their power. They're going to have to make space and move out of the way. And I think that is a thing that is scary for people. I mean, keeping it real, right? Everybody is on their own career success trajectory and thinking about giving up their leadership position. And when I say that, I mean, like there are a lot of new roles that people are getting as like chief of diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus and whatnot, these kind of specific DEI related roles. But that's not what I mean by making space. I mean, like, let's get more BIPOC individuals in these positions that have been there for the beginning of the, university's life. But I do think that people giving up power is going to be a challenge in these spaces. Prioritizing money in these areas is another issue. I mean, we've already touched on Meyerhoff Scholar Program and how much they dedicate towards doing what needs to be done. Reprioritizing where our money goes kind of tells you where our priorities are. And I think that that's going to be a big challenge for organizations and predominantly white institutions.
I'll not answer this one since we have some questions in the chat and we're a little short on time. So Hannah, if you're muted.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I missed all these questions because I wasn't paying attention to the chat. My bad. Let me quick look.
Sorry, I did not mean to put you on the spot.
No, I wasn't scrolling. It's my fault. I think one that I see here that's a good one is, are there ways in which employees can attempt to change the culture from the inside out, beyond petitioning their institution to get their act together?
I'll take this one. So, I mean, I'll chime in here. If we think about a hierarchical institution and the power, what that power structure looks like, I think sometimes what we might not always remember is how much power, how many more people there are at the bottom and how much more power we have than those at the top. That's something that I just think is so important. And that accountability for what happens at the top does not come from the top, especially when they have not held themselves accountable this whole entire time. That's never going to happen. The people hold those at the top accountable. And so I think what individuals can do outside of petitioning the institution is really, and this was the AVDS approach, and really, I imagine this is kind of almost every panelist's approach in some way, is starting to, for real, ask the institution what they're doing. You hold them accountable. Form groups so that you have the numbers to listen, so that they listen. Because once you start asking, they're not as interested in changing because you're just one person. But if you have a group of people that have a loud voice, you are the reason that they will change. You are the accountability. Ask them for what their approach is. Ask them for proof that their approach works. Ask for the data that should be there to support that their approach works. and really hold them to the fire for this accountability. I think when we say, and also team up with organizations on your institution or across institutions that are already doing this work, so that when you get that information back, you may not have that racial equity lens to be able to evaluate it, but someone else does for sure. And so team up with those folks and see, and you do an evaluation of what your institution's doing. That's what we did. Um, and then we saw the gaps and we pointed out the gaps and we said, this is what you need to do. And this is not work that unpaid BIPOC folks should need to do. And that's how it always works in institutions. And so there's so much space for every individual within an organization to really be able to hold the university accountable if they start to ask questions and demand that data, demand that vision, demand to see what the initiatives actually are. Because without that, institutions don't have to do anything. We can say that we have a commitment to anti-racism without actually having to do anything. We can say we are in an inclusive space without having to actually do anything. And so I think that's really one of the most powerful ways to move forward, is to really start holding the institutions accountable for what they say they value.
I add on to Antoinette, like that was fire. If you all didn't know, I'm saying it was. But I think you need to, coming to these meetings, your staff meetings, your faculty meetings, ready to look at it through a lens of a critically conscious lens, meaning that you're thinking about whose voices are not being lifted up right now, who's not in the room, what are the assumptions that are what is the hidden message or the assumption behind the statement that somebody just said. I think that is, if you want to consider that the fight, that could be the fight, just coming in with the level of intention, as well as supporting, amplifying the voices of color in that space. Don't just leave us hanging, right? Because it'll make you feel uncomfortable. You might have to, choose, oh, maybe so-and-so won't like that I said this. But the idea that a person thinks that this is a choice, whereas it may not be a choice, it may not feel like a choice for me or Anita or Antoinette, right? It's like, all right, where are we actually practicing some level of privilege by deciding to opt out and to stay a part of the silent majority? Like, that's the problem too. I think that's what we're seeing right now completely, is that silence is being complicit in the actions of really, really problematic action. So it's like, what are you going to do?
I love that. Yeah. And I kind of want to speak to the majority folks on this call. Somebody already mentioned in the chat, like, people shouldn't have to volunteer their extra time to do this. And oftentimes that falls on the shoulders of BIPOC individuals. One thing that I would love to see in more spaces is a critical analysis of whiteness amongst white folks. Like, I would like y'all to start thinking about what whiteness looks like and how it shows up. And as Dr. Womack said, like, let's not stay silent in our whiteness. Let's call it out. Let's be critical and have those conversations among majority groups, because it's a high emotional toll and emotional labor. Black women have shorter life expectancies, and all of the things that we have to put up with and the conversations that we have to have just to survive is shortening our life. So it would be really wonderful if folks, there's space for everybody in this conversation about racial equity. And I would really love to see majority folks really start to look at what whiteness is and how it's showing up, and to speak up and say something. We're all learning, so you might say something that doesn't come out right, or, people are maybe going to be defensive to you speaking up. But I think that we need to start having those conversations and being open with each other.
I also just want to piggyback on that really quick, in that I think what I hear oftentimes from white folks is that I don't want to say the wrong thing, and that stops me from acting. And yeah, who wants to say the wrong thing, especially in a culture? I could go off for another hour about how I feel about cancel culture and about whether or not I think that this is really the right vehicle for accountability. There are issues with it. But I think it's so important to remember that we are all going to make mistakes in this space. I have, through my work with AVDS, found ways that I've myself have upheld white supremacy because it's insidious, because you don't see it all the time. I would say, even as Letisha pointed out, our original structure of having a president at the top, it's a hierarchical structure that's steeped in white supremacy, and that's why we changed it. And we saw how we were cutting off the oxygen, basically, of like the voice of the people who were also working with us. And so we had to change that. And I think it's okay. What I want to see to be normalized is that we take risk. And when we're wrong, we're just like, damn, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. And here's why I know it's wrong now. And here's how I'll move forward. And you know what? Not everyone's going to accept that. And not everyone needs to accept that. You just need to worry about what you're doing and keep it moving and keep moving towards equity. That's the part I think people kind of get stuck at is, will I be held to the fire? Get some education, get a certain base understanding, and then know that mistakes will be made, because there always will be. And just take accountability and say exactly why it was an issue, say how you're adjusting moving forward. And that's all any of us can do in this space. That's all any of us can ever do. And so it takes a lot of bravery in order to do that. But that's what I want to see more, is just normalizing of bravery and normalizing of mistakes being made and normalizing of just apologizing and taking accountability for what happened.
Perfectionism is a characteristic of white supremacy culture. So if you can just acknowledge your mistakes and that you're not perfect, you're already working to dismantle that. So yes, Antoinette.
All right, we're running out of time here, and I want to respect everyone's time, so I'll just finish off with this final question that's kind of pretty not straightforward, but might be a quick answer. Is, if there's no intersectionality in your workplace or your local industry, how do you think BIPOC mentees feel about having a white mentor? What advice do you have for the mentor, or is a BIPOC mentor that is located outside the area the best way to proceed in this scenario? And I also just want to say, I've learned a ton from this. I'm going to throw the donation link back in the chat. I really hope you guys I'm pretty sure our audience has learned a lot, but if you guys can donate, the donations will be split amongst the panelists, and we really appreciate their time for all that they've done. So we'll finish off with this question and then let everyone get on with their day.
I could quickly say that you do not have to share the same identities as your student in order to be a good, caring, effective mentor. That's not the answer. So that's not an out. It's about seeing your student, knowing who are they, what do they care about, what do they value, are you sharing what you value, right? And I think it's about connecting on a very humane level, as well as checking your own assumptions, and not expecting them to be the door to this particular community. You need to do your own work. You read some other books, watch some documentaries, so that this student can do what they want to do in this space, which is to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I almost don't have anything else to add other than to have the idea that, I don't think this was intentional, but in some ways the question kind of takes the autonomy away from the BIPOC student. I don't think any of us can say what each BIPOC student would want, because none of us know, because everyone's an individual, so we don't know what we want and what we would need. So I just want to echo Dr. Womack in that it's really about the individual. And if a person is kind of nervous about mentoring a BIPOC student, wondering if they'll be, safe enough and all of that, then education is key to learn how not to recapitulate those harmful and toxic behaviors.
I always like to advocate for a strong network. You can't get everything you need from one mentor. So we think about that a lot, Antoinette and I, in the work that we do, is how can we create networks and pockets of people as opposed to just relying on one person for everything. So the more individuals you can surround yourself with, I think the better.
I just ditto what everyone said. Those answers were all great. And that's exactly what I was thinking. So no more input. It was perfect.
All right. I want to thank you all again for being panelists on here. I think everyone learned a ton. I know I did. And I just want to thank you for taking your time and speaking to us. I think the chat echoes my feelings about this conversation. I think it was super, super helpful for me. So at this time, we'll end the recording and everyone can go on with their respective days. But thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.